That concludes topical questions. The next item of business is a statement by Shirley-Ann Somerville on the Supreme Court's judgment in relation to gender representation on Public Boards Scotland Act 2018. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Shirley-Ann Somerville.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, for this opportunity to update Parliament on the Supreme Court's decision to uphold the For Women Scotland appeal. The Scottish Government does, of course, accept the judgment of the Supreme Court. It is a significant legal ruling, and it is right that we take time to consider it carefully. Before I turn to the details of the judgment, it is important to recognise the tone and the temperature of the surrounding debate concerning real individuals in our community, in our workplaces and in our families that has often been deeply distressing to them. It should be clear to all of us in this chamber, regardless of our view on any of these matters, including in the judgment last Wednesday, that it has had a very significant impact on many people. This judgment, as the Supreme Court made clear, must not be used as a licence for division and hostility. The pursuit of equality for women and for trans people is our collective responsibility. All of us in this chamber must ensure that the rights and dignity of all are upheld, and our debate must be rooted in empathy, compassion and equality. Indeed, in his delivery of the judgment, Lord Hodge, giving the opinion of the Court, said that the Court counsel against reading this judgment as a triumph of one or more groups in our society at the expense of another. It is not. Turning to the judgment, Presiding Officer, this case centres on the guidance issued for the Gender Representation on Public Bodies Scotland Act 2018 and the meaning of women set out in that guidance, which is the same meaning as under the Equality Act 2010. The Scottish Government successfully defended our guidance twice in both the Outer and Inner House. However, the Supreme Court is the final decision-maker on such legal issues, and it has delivered a carefully considered judgment. The definition of women in the guidance was the definition in the Equality Act. And as we were guided on the meaning of that definition by guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the EHRC, which is the enforcement body for the 2010 Act. As we heard in last week's judgment, issues arose from a tension between two pieces of Westminster legislation and how they interact. The question of compatibility between the Gender Recognition Act of 2004 and the Equality Act 2010 was central to the Court's ruling. In paragraph 8, the Supreme Court said that the central question in relation to the appeal was whether the 2010 Act treats a trans woman with a Gender Recognition Certificate, a GRC, as a woman for all purposes within the scope of its provisions, or whether when the 2010 Act refers to a woman and sex, it is referring to a biological woman and biological sex. The Supreme Court concluded that the meaning of the terms sex, man and woman in the 2010 Act is biological. The Supreme Court notes within its judgment that in the statutory guidance to the Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Act 2018, that Scottish ministers reflected the stance of the EHRC that a person issued with a full GRC in the acquired gender of female is a woman within the meaning of the Equality Act. It concluded that the Scottish Government guidance on the Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Act 2018 is incorrect in relation to its definition of women. The judgment also makes it very clear that trans people continue to have protection and rights. As the press summary issued by the Supreme Court on the judgment said, trans people are protected from discrimination on the grounds of gender reassignment. They are also able to invoke the provisions on direct discrimination and harassment and indirect discrimination on the basis of sex. In the light of case law interpreting the relevant provisions, a trans woman can claim sex discrimination because she is perceived to be a woman. We fully accept the Supreme Court's judgment and have begun to analyse the impact. We are amending the guidance on the public boards legislation to take account of the ruling. There has been commentary as to the implications of this ruling in respect of the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill. This bill was prevented from proceeding to royal assent by an order made by the then Secretary of State. Following the judgment last week, the Scottish Government has no plans to bring it back. While the UK Government has indicated they intend to bring forward proposals to reform the Gender Recognition Act 2004, we have not yet seen any firm proposals. This Government stands ready to engage constructively on any plans following last week's judgment. Gender recognition is a fundamental piece of equality legislation, and let me be very clear, this Government does not support the repeal of the 2004 Act. Presiding Officer, immediately following last week's judgment, I wrote to the UK Government counterpart seeking an urgent meeting. And this reflects that the judgment does, of course, have implications across the UK, given that the 2004 Act extends across the UK and the 2010 Act extends to England, Wales and Scotland. And I'm awaiting a response to that letter. I, along with the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care, will also be meeting with the EHRC on Thursday and will seek an update on their plans for renewed guidance by the summer. The Government calls for that process to be inclusive, and ensuring engagement will be with all of those on whom it will impact. This guidance is also important for the Government across Scotland, England and Wales, as well as public authorities and the private sector and voluntary sector organisations following the Supreme Court judgment. All organisations must comply with all relevant legislation, and guidance from the EHRC will be key in this process. Now, I wanted to reach out to stakeholders as soon as possible after the judgment to give the Government's initial response and to offer to meet again to discuss the Scottish Government's ongoing work. Stakeholders that represent trans and non-binary people are reporting real anxiety from their networks and service users and concerns about their daily lives. It is significant that the Supreme Court stated in their judgment that the rights of the trans community are enshrined in law. And I want to reassure our trans community that you are valued, and the Scottish Government is fully committed to protecting everyone's rights, and that includes your community. I have also had the opportunity to speak to the Women's Rights Network, and I was grateful for their time and hearing directly from them about their views both on the judgment and on its implementation. As I have done today, I restated categorically to them that the Scottish Government fully accepts the judgment of the Supreme Court and is now working on next steps. Given the length of the judgment, it is important to work through this in detail, and I have offered to meet again once that work has been undertaken. An invite was also sent to For Women Scotland, which they have chosen not to accept at this time, but fed back that they want us to move on with implementation. And I can assure them and this chamber that that work is progressing. Presiding Officer, I spoke earlier about the principles of empathy, compassion and equality. And in these principles, I firmly believe that the role of this Parliament is to provide leadership. Ensuring equality, inclusion and human rights are not optional values. They are the foundation of a fair society and at the heart of our public services. This Government, and I hope all in our Scottish Parliament, will continue to advance equality and protect the rights of women, girls and the LGBTQI+ community. Our work reflects a clear and enduring belief that everyone in Scotland should be free to live their lives with dignity, safety and respect. We will continue to work closely with LGBT+ organisations to ensure their communities are empowered and human rights protected. Our Parliament has a strong track record advancing the rights of LGBT+ people, and I am sure we will all continue to ensure that further progress is made. We engage proudly and visibly with the LGBT+ communities during Pride season and LGBT History Month, and we must do so throughout the year. And the Scottish Government will continue to accelerate equality through our National Advisory Council on Women and Girls, driving real change in Scotland by challenging systemic inequality and ensuring that the voices of women and girls are not only heard but acted upon. And indeed, this Parliament has also been at the forefront of many changes, including legislation on domestic abuse and on victims of sexual violence. That's why this Government has, for example, progressed our world-leading Equally Safe strategy, tackling violence against women and girls. But we all recognise, I'm sure, that there remains so much more to do to tackle these challenges, barriers and dangers that women and girls face. To that end, I announced at the end of February that the Scottish Government will work in partnership with the National Advisory Council, as they have requested, to develop an equality strategy for women and girls before the end of this Parliament. These actions demonstrate that equality is not just a principle, it is something we are committed to making real in people's lives every day. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I'd like to return to where I began, with the people we all serve. The issues that surround the Supreme Court case are challenging and will need careful consideration so that the public sector can ensure the dignity and safety of everyone that uses their services. It is vital that the EHRC now issue clear, practical guidance in response to that judgment. This judgment has confirmed the definition of women under the Equality Act. There have been many challenging arguments over the past 5 years, and I hope that we can move to a point where we again focus on progressing equality for the people of Scotland. The pursuit of equality is not a contest between communities. It is a collective effort to build a fairer Scotland for all and the foundation on which this Parliament was built. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 35 minutes for questions, after which we'll move on to the next item of business. And I'd be grateful if members who wish to put a question were to press their request to speak buttons now. And I call Russell Finlay.
Thank you, President Officer. From the very beginning, my party has been the sole voice of reason in this Parliament to warn of the dangers of gender self-ID. We stood up for women's rights and urged the Government to drop this toxic and divisive issue. Now, John Swinney wants to distance himself from it all, but as Nicola Sturgeon's deputy and her strongest ally, he was right behind it. He was willing to sacrifice women's rights, including the rights to single-sex spaces and services. He voted down reasonable, common-sense amendments to the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, including my own, to stop predatory men, including rapists and other sex offenders, from exploiting self-ID. So in light of the momentous Supreme Court judgment, John Swinney owes an apology to the people of Scotland, but especially to women. And this harmful ideology must now be rooted out of our entire public sector: schools, prisons, hospitals and policing. Far too much time and taxpayers' money has been wasted in this already. The country needs to move on. Politicians must focus on the concerns of people in the real world. And I have 3 questions. Will the SNP government now say sorry? Will they give a clear and categorical commitment not to resurrect the Gender Reform Bill in any way? And will they guarantee that gender self-ID will be excised from public bodies? Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think and I hope that Russell Finlay heard the part of my statement where I talked about the Gender Recognition Bill and the fact that the Government has no plans to reintroduce or bring forward that work. And very importantly, I also mentioned in my statement that the Government absolutely accepts the judgment of the Supreme Court. Now, we have acted on good faith in this question. Again, as I said in my statement, it was important that the Supreme Court recognised that the work that the Government undertook on this issue was based on EHRC guidance. But it is important that now that the Supreme Court has made its decision, that we move forward to look at the policies, practice and guidance across government and public bodies. And as I said again in my statement, that work has begun, is ongoing, and I will keep Parliament updated in due course as that work progresses.
Jackie Bailey.
The judgment from the Supreme Court in the case of 4 Women Scotland versus Scottish ministers was unanimous and clear. The term woman in the Equality Act relates to biological sex. The Scottish Government, though, has got itself into a position where it's encouraged practice to get ahead of the law. Guidance has been issued by the Government to a range of public bodies, including the NHS, which now needs to be revised. And this will be at considerable cost to those organisations in both time and money. It's not just a matter for the EHRC, so can the Minister set out a timetable for the Scottish Government producing revised guidance and advise when this will be implemented in the NHS and across the public sector? It's also the case that the SNP government's track record generally in relation to legal action has been poor, whether it's related to aspects of the Salmond inquiry and former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon or the Supreme Court action on an independence referendum. There have been at least 10 cases of failed action. This is another case of the taxpayer picking up the tab. So can the Minister advise the Chamber how much taxpayers' money has been spent in defending this case and all the other unsuccessful legal actions by the Government?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as I said earlier, the Government did successfully within the inner and outer courts win cases on this aspect. But, as I again said, the Supreme Court is the final arbiter of this, and it is important that now that they have made that judgment, we respect that judgment. I think it's important that the Scottish Government does undertake cases where we need to explain and defend the positions that we are in. It is important then, once the judgments have been made, that we respect that judgment and we move on that. And that is exactly the point that we are at. When it comes to the cost, we will be at the point of being able to publish the cost for that when the case is fully complete, and there still may be other costs that may come forward on this. So I'm unable to give Jackie Baillie a number at this point, but as I certainly have done in previous cases in matters like these, those matters are then made public. So I will keep the member updated on this. She mentions the guidance, whether it's in the NHS or elsewhere. I think it's very important that we take account of what happens on Thursday when both myself and the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Social Care meet the EHRC. I've listened very carefully to press reports that the EHRC intend to have guidance by the summer, but I look forward hopefully to being able to get a bit more detail of that in person. So let me see if Jackie Baillie will forgive me how much more information the EHRC are able to provide at that meeting, and that of course will be up to them. It is their guidance and their timetable. Because I am still waiting for that meeting in person, or the meeting with EHRC on the timetable, I'm not in a position to be able to say when guidance will be updated across government, because I think it's very important I hear from the EHRC directly first, rather than just listening to what I've read in the press. So I need to be able to take that meeting with my colleague on Thursday. But I can assure Jackie Baillie that across the public sector, we are, across the Scottish Government, and indeed I'm sure across the public sector, we are looking very carefully, not just at guidance, but policy and practice as well. Those matters, if the members in the Conservative benches will forgive me, I'm sure I'll be happy to take their questions in due course once I respond to Jackie Baillie. But once we have the timetable from the EHRC, I'll be able to move forward, as the Scottish Government will, across government guidance as we know more about what the EHRC will say.
Fulton McGregor, to be followed by Tess White.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I also accept and respect the court ruling. As the Cabinet Secretary has said, Lord Hodge has stated the ruling should not be seen as a triumph of one group at the expense of the other, and stressed the legal protections currently afforded to trans people. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that any implications of this ruling, forming part of a complex area of law, must be discussed sensitively and carefully with the right advice in respect to all groups affected?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think Fulton McGregor is quite right to point to those words about sensitively and carefully considering and with the right advice in front. And that's why I mentioned in my answer to Jackie Baillie the meeting I will be having with the EHRC. We, of course, as I say once again, accept the judgment of the Supreme Court, and we have to remember that it's made a real impact on people across our communities and in our workplaces, and many have found that distressing. But as we move forward with implementation of the Supreme Court judgment, we always have to ensure that we're proceeding on the basis of the rule of law, of equality and inclusion and respect for human rights for everyone. And I give Fulton McGregor my reassurance that that's the principles that the Government will be holding to the rule of law, to the work of and the judgment of the Supreme Court, and to equality, inclusion and human rights for all.
Tess White, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Scotland's public bodies, by definition, are an extension of the Scottish Government. Last week, the Supreme Court exposed the Scottish Government's fallacy, but the SNP's reckless ideology has become embedded, like Japanese knotweed, in our public institutions. Whilst it smacks of asking an arsonist to extinguish the fire, will the Cabinet Secretary secure written assurances from all of its public bodies that they will put the policies in place complying with the Supreme Court ruling within 3 months after meeting the EHRC?
Secretary.
So I think it's very important to give the EHRC more time than the meeting that we have on Thursday. So with the greatest respect to Tess White, I can absolutely understand the need, the desire and the obligation indeed for pace on this matter. And we will see what the EHRC is able to share with Scottish Government ministers on Thursday. But I can give her the reassurance that across the Scottish Government there is work that has now begun to ensure that policies, practices, procedures and guidance are absolutely compatible with the judgment of the Supreme Court and with the law. That rule of law is exceptionally important to the Government, and it's very important that we do that right across the Scottish Government and right across the public sector, and indeed further to that. And it is a matter that's not only for this government but for other governments within the UK, which is why I think it's also important that governments can have discussions on those issues to be able to deal with the collective challenge we have to ensure that our guidance is fit for purpose.
Rona Mackay, to be followed by Paul O'Kane.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Many trans people in Scotland and across the UK will be confused and frightened by the Supreme Court judgment. Can the Minister clarify again how the rights of trans people, including those who already hold gender recognition certificates, can be protected and upheld?
Cabinet Secretary.
Last Thursday I did meet with stakeholders that represent trans community and non-binary people, and I think it is exceptionally important to recognise the real distress that they are reporting from the communities, and that's very, very important. The Supreme Court, within paragraph 100 of its judgment, talked about the Gender Recognition Act and talked about gender recognition certificates. And I think it's very, very important, as well as the other aspects of the Supreme Court judgment that have perhaps had more public scrutiny and traction within the media, to also draw upon the attention of the Chamber and wider society. That paragraph 100, talking about the Gender Recognition Act 2004 and the continued relevance and importance of GRC and the provision of legal recognition of the rights for transgender people. And I hope that gives them some reassurance as we go into what is a difficult time for many members of the trans and non-binary community.
Paul O'Kane, to be followed by Joe Fitzpatrick.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. It is important that the court ruling is, of course, respected, and indeed the court itself is respected. I think also we should reflect on the words of Lord Hodge himself, as the Cabinet Secretary did, that this must not be read as a triumph of one or more groups at the expense of another. I wonder, Presiding Officer, if I can return to the issue of legal advice the Government receives. It's already been raised that this is not just the first case that the Government have lost, but it enjoins a long line of court cases lost by the Scottish Government, and of course not just on this subject matter, but on many others. So I wonder if I can firstly ask the Cabinet Secretary, does she have confidence in the legal advice that is received by ministers from the Legal Directorate? And given this point of reflection, would she consider reviewing how legal advice is sought by the Government, how it is delivered, how it is requested, and indeed how it is acted upon, given the number of legal cases that are now lost by the Government?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Paul O'Kane for that question? And he is absolutely right to once again talk about respecting the court ruling, and doing so, as Lord Hodge indeed said himself, for all of us who are discussing that to do it in the right manner. And I thank him for the basis of that question. I think it's very important when we talk about this particular case to recognise, and I make no apology for restating this, Presiding Officer, that the Supreme Court did say within their judgment that at all times the Scottish Government within this guidance had followed the guidance of the EHRC. And I would have thought that that is what stakeholders and opposition members would like us to do. We followed the guidance of the EHRC when developing our own guidance. Now, the Supreme Court has made a judgment on that guidance, and it's important that we reflect on that. And that's why it's important that the EHRC will then be updating their guidance as well. That is exactly the basis of the case as we brought it forward. But in saying that, given the Supreme Court's judgment, I accept that judgment and we will move forward with that basis of implementation.
Jo Fitzpatrick, to be followed by Pam Gossel.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Speaking to the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee, Victor Madrigal-Borloz, the UN independent expert on sexual orientation and gender, commented that mention has been made of trans rights, but there is no such thing as trans rights, or gay rights, or lesbian rights. There are human rights of people who are gay, human rights of people who are lesbian, and human rights of people who are trans. As such, can the Cabinet Secretary confirm what steps the Scottish Government is taking to uphold human rights for all?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Jo Fitzpatrick will be aware that the Government has been working on the Human Rights Bill, and we are absolutely committed to bringing that forward in the next session of Parliament, subject, of course, Presiding Officer, to the 2026 elections. It is important that we are continuing our work on the detailed policy proposals for that Human Rights Bill, and we hope to be able to publish those detailed policy proposals on that bill before the summer recess to allow the constructive engagement on this important piece of work so we can move forward with the Parliament's, I think, good track record on developing human rights for all.
Pam Gossel, to be followed by Emma Roddick.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week, I was at the UK Supreme Court and got to witness a monumental legal judgment on the definition of the word woman, which was issued thanks to the excellent work of For Women Scotland. In recent days, we have seen statues defaced, death threats issued against women's rights campaigners, and a video of Deputy Convener of the Equalities Committee, Maggie Chapman, MSP, accusing the Supreme Court judges of bigotry, prejudice and hatred. This is shocking behaviour and has been condemned by the Faculty of Advocates. Therefore, I'd like to ask the Cabinet Secretary if she condemns this behaviour and what action has been taken by the Scottish Government to guarantee the safety of women.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think it's important, Presiding Officer, that for the avoidance of any doubt, I take this away from the issue in question and give a general response, which is the response we should give on every single example of this. There is no excuse for vandalism or criminal behaviour. There is no excuse for death threats. And that is regardless of who that comes from, Presiding Officer, whether that's towards activists or whether it is towards members of this Parliament, regardless of their views on the Supreme Court. And I think it's very important that I say that is regardless of where people's views were at the start, are at the beginning or are at any stage in this discussion, there is no excuse for criminal behaviour or poor behaviour. And I think that's a particular responsibility for those of us within this chamber. And I again absolutely say that the Scottish Government accepts the decision of the Supreme Court and respects their right to do so.
Emma Roddick, to be followed by Maggie Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've had a number of trans constituents get in touch, distressed about this judgment, and while it's still unclear how this will impact many situations in practice, as reviews of policy are carried out with the necessary thought and time, not everybody will consider things so carefully. People have jumped to conclusions, and that has direct, immediate impact on interactions in the real world. Now, I can reassure those affected that I continue to be their ally, and many of their neighbours have actually reached out to offer their support as well. But could the Cabinet Secretary offer any further reassurance for the LGBTQ+ community in the Highlands and Islands and beyond, and speak to the Scottish Government's position on upholding and progressing their rights?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I thank Emma Roddick for that question? And I can once again restate this Government's determination to uphold human rights for all communities, and that includes the trans and non-binary communities. Trans men and women are our friends, they are our neighbours, they are our work colleagues, they are members of our family, and it's important that we recognise that the trans community has always and will always be a valued member of our community. Now that, of course, may mean, and I'm sure does mean from the discussions that I've also had with members of the trans community, that there is a great deal of upset and worry following the Supreme Court's decision, which is why this Government, and I hope this Parliament, will go forward with careful consideration and due diligence, and do so in a respectful manner for everybody involved.
Maggie Chapman, to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you. Last weekend saw thousands of trans people and their friends and allies gather across the UK, including on the streets of Edinburgh, Glasgow, Dundee and Aberdeen. Trans people want to be able to live their lives like any of us, without fear of prejudice or violence. But they are concerned about how their lives will be affected, including access to healthcare and other essential services. I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's comments about advancing equality of women, girls and the LGBTQI+ community. But what further assurances can she provide today that the dignity and safety of trans people will be upheld and that they will have access to the services and facilities they need to participate fully in daily life?
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, we should all be able to live without prejudice and violence in our society. It does no one any favours if there is prejudice, violence, or indeed even just a threat of violence, as we discuss particularly sensitive issues. I said in my answer to Emma Roddick, it is important that we recognise the trans and non-binary community as being our friends, our neighbours, members of our family. That's how I will continue my work as Minister with responsibility for equalities. Now, of course, the Scottish Government, with the acceptance of the Supreme Court judgment, will have to look at policies, practices and procedures across government. That may mean that services and facilities may have to be delivered in a different way in some aspects, but it is important that everyone has access to services and facilities, and that's an important point that we will continue to consider.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Michelle Thompson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, my party accepts the judgment of the Supreme Court and the legal clarity that it provides. But we also recognise that the trans and non-binary people that we all represent will be afraid today. They are concerned about what this judgment will mean for them in practice, about what rights and protections the law now provides them. And given the tone of some of the attendant coverage around the judgment, they will even have questions about how welcome they are in our society. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that with some urgency there is now a job of work for both of our governments in providing them with the reassurance and legal guidance that they need in order to live their lives in acceptance and dignity?
Cabinet Secretary.
Alex Cole-Hamilton raises a very important point. He is quite right, once again, to talk about the real fear within the trans and non-binary community, and they are afraid. And it's absolutely important that we all recognise that. And with that, those fears, we also have to accept and follow our work through on the basis of what does that mean in practice for the trans and non-binary community. How welcome do they feel is not necessarily just about what it means in practice, but it also means about how we carry on our debate and our discussions on these issues. So it's important that we talk about the practicalities, and it's also important about the perceptions that people will have and will pick up by the way that we carry this debate forward. So I give him my assurance that we will give very careful consideration as we move forward with the implementation of the Supreme Court judgment, not just to ensure that we are obeying the rule of law and we are implementing that judgment, but we do so in a sensitive manner and we do so speaking to everyone, regardless of people's opinions, regardless of what community they are part of. It's important that we speak to everyone. But then once we have spoken to people, always our policy, our practices and our guidance will be based on the rule of law.
Bill Thompson, to be followed by Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I note the conciliatory tone adopted by the Cabinet Secretary? And I'm especially pleased now that women's voices will eventually be listened to. And could I add to the list, in addition to For Women in Scotland, the likes of Sex Matters, Murray Blackburn Mackenzie, who have done such sterling work, LGBT Alliance and so on. Many of us noticed at the weekend the really quite shocking and disgusting language being used at some of the debates, including wishes to urinate and defecate on women. And it's ironic that sex was not included as a protected characteristic in the hate crime bill, with the promise of a misogyny bill. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline any indication of when this is going to come forward? I appreciate it's a different portfolio, but fundamentally where it will have women as a sex class at its heart.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Again, I would reiterate there is no excuse for poor, bad and particularly criminal behaviour. There is just simply no excuse for this, Presiding Officer. But I think particularly pertinent when we are discussing an issue of such sensitivity, and whereas Alec Cole-Hamilton and others have spoken to, there is real fear from people who have raised their voice on this issue. Michelle Thompson is quite right to point to the fact that gender or sex was not part of the hate crime legislation. She, I know, is well aware of the work that's been undertaken and the work towards a misogyny bill. Clearly, given the ruling of the Supreme Court, we are now giving careful consideration to the impacts of the Supreme Court ruling on the work that will be undertaken on the misogyny bill, and the Cabinet Secretary for Justice will be able to update Parliament in due course. But it is important, once again, and I stress, Presiding Officer, that we do take time to look at that judgment, that 88-page judgment from the Supreme Court, to give that exceptionally careful consideration, particularly on an issue of such importance such as the misogyny bill.
Rachel Hamilton, to be followed by Karen Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The SNP have tied themselves in knots trying to define what a woman is. John Swinney still doesn't know. Discussing women's rights has been met in and out of this chamber with accusations of transphobia. Stating the obvious has led to women being called bigots. But thanks to the Supreme Court, we all know where we now stand. So will the Cabinet Secretary now apologise to all women who have been vilified, lost their jobs, experienced sexual harassment, voyeurism, serious assault and intimidation, all because of her government's self-ID policy? And will the Scottish Government instruct all public sector authorities to settle any ongoing legal cases or employment tribunals relating to the provision of single-sex spaces?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, it would not be appropriate for me to comment on ongoing legal cases, and that is an important obligation on Scottish ministers. What I would also say is that, and I've said this before, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government carried forward its work on the guidance on gender representation on public boards in good faith, using, as the Supreme Court judgment said within its own judgment, using the EHRC guidance. That was what was followed as we developed our guidance. In saying that, we of course recognise and accept the judgment of the Supreme Court, and that's exactly why we are now moving forward to the implementation, and the rule of law must be followed within not just, of course, the Scottish Government, but everyone that is impacted by the Supreme Court judgment.
Karen Adam, to be followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The ruling provides clarity on the interpretation of two pieces of legislation, both of which were passed at Westminster. Can the Cabinet Secretary say any more about the relevant engagement with the UK Government going forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, my officials are meeting with their counterparts from the UK Government on Thursday the 24th of April, and as I said in my statement immediately following the judgment, I wrote to the UK Government seeking an urgent meeting. I think it is important at this time, as the UK Government and the Scottish Government work through the impacts of the Supreme Court judgment. I think it's important that those discussions take place, both at official level and, I hope, also at a ministerial level. As I said, I think during my statement, and if I haven't, for avoidance of any doubt, I'm still waiting for a reply to that letter that I sent to the UK Government.
Claire Baker, to be followed by Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary has indicated she is soon to meet with the EHRC to discuss guidance. I have previously raised how intimate care in medical and care settings is delivered and the patient's understanding of the description of a woman doctor or carer. Does the Cabinet Secretary think that the Supreme Court's judgment has any implications for the definition of a woman in these settings? And can I ask if that is part of the discussions planned with the EHRC?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, the amount that we will be able to discuss within one meeting with the EHRC will be limited, just because, as I'm sure Claire Baker will understand, particularly since the Supreme Court judgment, there is quite a lot to get through now, so she'll forgive me if I'm not quite sure how much of that discussion we will be able to have on Thursday. But I think it is very important that as we move forward following the meeting that we have on Thursday, that there is, I hope, a regular dialogue where the HRC will be able to keep the Scottish Government informed about its work. Now, it is up to them, and rightly so, independent of all governments, to be able to take forward that work on guidance. But at least for us to know the timetable for that work, or when at least they hope the timetable for that work to be published, I think is very important. What is we will be able to discuss on Thursday, I hope will provide us with the principles and a wider understanding. We may not get to the level of detail that she wishes us to do so on Thursday. But as we go through, both within the NHS and other parts of government, of course, ministers will keep Parliament updated as guidance changes or if policy and practice changes. So I give her that reassurance.
Megan Gallagher, to be followed by Martin Whitfield.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There is not a single mention in the Cabinet Secretary's statement about the huge amount of taxpayers' money that has been wasted by the Scottish Government arguing about the definition of a woman. Taxpayers expect their money to be spent on helping our NHS, improving our roads, keeping our streets safe, not court cases that aim to defend the indefensible. So will the Cabinet Secretary come clean with the public and confirm how much money was spent by the SNP government to argue against biological sex in court?
Cabinet Secretary.
As I said, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government had already taken this both to the inner and outer house, and the reason it's got to the Supreme Court is the fact that that is the due process that has been followed. And now that we've got to the final decision point, we respect the judgment on that. I hope Megan Gallagher will genuinely understand that the final costs are still being calculated on this. The judgment was only in the middle of last week, and there are some final aspects of that case that will still need to be finalised. But once those final costs are calculated, they will be published in due course.
Martin Whitfield, to be followed by Ash Regan.
I'm very grateful, Presiding Officer. I'd like to go back to the Cabinet Secretary's response to my colleague Paul O'Kane. In the statement, the Cabinet Secretary talks about the Scottish Government successfully defending the guidance twice, and this seems to have arisen because you followed the my apologies, because the Scottish Government followed the EHRC advice. Does the Cabinet Secretary have any concerns about the quality of advice the Scottish Government are receiving when it's just taking into account another body's legal advice, and will she look at that?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, with the greatest respect to Martin Whitfield, the HRC isn't just another body. They're the arbiter and regulator on issues to do with equality. So, quite frankly, I would be astonished if the Scottish Government did something that wasn't reliant on the HRC guidance. This isn't just another body, Presiding Officer, and that's why I think it is important that the Supreme Court did reference the fact that the Scottish Government had followed EHRC guidance, and that was the basis on which our case was taken forward.
Ash Regan, to be followed by Jamie Green.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We all owe For Women Scotland and the many people that supported them a huge debt of gratitude, and one of them is in the gallery with us today. By contrast, this Parliament and this Government have let the women of Scotland down badly. They lectured us about tone, including again today, and patronised us, whilst at the same time giving away women's hard-won rights. This Parliament and this Government turned away as women's reputations were being trashed. Women were being suspended or hounded out of their jobs simply for stating that sex is immutable. And they refused to listen when women were being harmed in single-sex spaces, services and sports. Politicians that did not stand up for women should hang their heads in shame. How did this Parliament and this Government get this so wrong and let Scottish women down so badly? And if I can contradict the Cabinet Secretary, I would say there should be no more delay in acting on this, because Scottish women have waited long enough.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would hope that we could all agree that tone's important in this. I've heard from members today about the fears, the concerns of both activists who have taken this. I'm sorry, Presiding Officer, I'm slightly struggling to know if I was going to say if Ms Regan wanted an intervention, but I've just remembered it's a statement. But I'm happy to try and answer her questions if she will let me. I think it is important that we will look at the intone all of this. And we've heard today about the concerns about threats and intimidation to both women who took forward this case and also threats and intimidation towards the trans and non-binary community. That's why the tone is important, because it's important for everybody involved in this. We've also always, as a government, respected single-sex spaces and respected the exemptions that are within the Equality Act. And it's important that we move forward again on that basis. And I can reassure the member that there is not a delay. The work is continuing, but I hope she would also recognise that the HRC have an important role to play in this, and that's why what they have to say on this, both in terms of what they may be able to say on Thursday on an initial meeting and their guidance that will follow, is so exceptionally important.
Jamie Green, to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I appreciate that this debate does raise as many emotive issues and has very strong views on all sides, and I think that is to be accepted and respected as well. But I hope that whatever one's views on this debate, we all accept that at the heart of it lies people, human beings who are our fellow Scots, those who vote for us and those who don't. But it's also true that gender recognition certificates have been issued in Scotland for nearly 2 decades. Whilst it's a relatively small group of people, many of those holders of those certificates will now be wondering what legal rights these certificates still offer them, if any at all. So can I ask specifically and on a technical level if the Scottish Government is willing to undertake any legal advice or analysis or offer any guidance to holders of these certificates as to their future and their day-to-day lives?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I welcome Jamie Green to his new position within this chamber? And I think it's important, again, that he talks very powerfully about at the heart of this is people. And I think as we go through this discussion, regardless of people's views on this and regardless of their views before the Supreme Court reached its judgment, it has reached its judgment. We must move to implementation, and we must do so always bearing in mind, as he rightly says we should, that people are at the heart of everything that we do. When it comes to gender recognition certificates, I think I mentioned in my previous answers and statements the important parts of the Supreme Court judgment, such as paragraph 100, that talked particularly about gender recognition certificates. He knows well, I know that the 2004 Act was a piece that was passed by Westminster. It has been there now for some time. It is important that we now reflect on what is in the judgment from the Supreme Court about still the importance of gender recognition certificates and also for the Supreme Court's statements around the rights of the trans community still being protected within the Equality Act due to gender reassignment.
Murdo Fraser, to be followed by Sue Webber.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The position of NHS Fife in relation to the Sandy Peggy Employment Tribunal must now be entirely unsustainable in light of the Supreme Court judgment. Like me, the Cabinet Secretary will have constituents in Fife, thousands of individuals waiting too long for vital treatments because NHS Fife is starved of resources, and yet they are spending what must now be hundreds of thousands of pounds in legal costs defending the indefensible. Isn't it time the Scottish Government instructed them to throw in the towel and stop wasting our money?
Cabinet Secretary.
As Murdo Fraser well knows, that this is a matter between the employer NHS Fife and the employees. It is subject to ongoing judicial proceedings in the Employment Tribunal, and it would not be appropriate for me to comment on such a live case.
And Sue Webber.
The Cabinet Secretary has stated many times that the rule of law is important and must be followed right across the public sector. Cabinet Secretary, I trust this extends to organisations that receive grant funding from the Scottish Government. And can I ask that the Scottish Government will now only support organisations financially that respect and abide with the rule of law?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as I think I've said on a number of occasions now, it is important that both the Scottish Government, public bodies and indeed other organisations reflect very carefully on the Supreme Court judgment and ensure that they are abiding by not only the Equality Act but all other relevant pieces of legislation.
Thank you. That concludes the ministerial statement. Point of order, Douglas Ross.
Accept a motion without notice, Standing Order 8.13.3, to extend this debate to allow those of us, including myself, who requested a question of the Cabinet Secretary to put our questions to them on this monumental statement. I think it's only right that this Parliament is able to hear all of the voices on this issue and hopefully get answers from the Scottish Government.
Thank you, Mr Ross. The Bureau discussed allocation of time this afternoon on this very statement, and that time was extended, and I've now extended that extension, and it's important that we protect time for other issues. And there will, of course, be further opportunities this week to put questions to the Government on this matter. That concludes the ministerial statement.